Marilyn Monroe. The name itself is a kind of magic. It conjures an explosion of platinum blonde hair, a flash of red lipstick, a breathy, intimate voice that could melt celluloid. She wasn't just a movie star. She was a cultural phenomenon, an atom bomb of glamour and sexuality dropped onto the buttoned-up landscape of 1950s America. She was the ultimate fantasy, the embodiment of a dream that Hollywood created and sold to a public desperate for an escape. For decades, the world has been utterly captivated by that dream, an obsession that has only grown stronger since her death. But on a summer night in August 1962, the dream came to a devastating end. In a locked room in a quiet Los Angeles suburb, the most famous woman in the world was found dead, naked in her bed, the telephone receiver still clutched in her hand. The official cause was a probable suicide from a massive overdose of barbiturates. But from the moment the news broke, that simple explanation felt hollow, a flimsy final scene for a life lived with such earth-shattering intensity. There were too many inconsistencies, too many unanswered questions. Why were there no pills found in her stomach? Why was there no water glass by her bed? Why was there a strange hours-long delay before the police were called? And what was the truth behind the whispered rumors of her dangerous entanglements with the most powerful family in America, the Kennedys? For 60 years, her death has remained one of history's great unresolved mysteries, a story shrouded in conspiracy, secrets, and silence. But the real mystery is not just how she died, it's how she lived. And to understand that, we must peel back the layers of glamour, myth, and speculation to find the person at the heart of it all. This is the story of the lonely, intelligent, and wounded girl named Norma Jeane, who built a goddess named Marilyn as a shield against the world, only to find herself trapped inside her own creation. It's the story of how Hollywood made a woman into a dream, and how that dream, in the end, destroyed her. To understand the supernova that was Marilyn Monroe, you must first understand the world that forged her. The Los Angeles of the 1920s and 30s was a city of dazzling, desperate dreams. It was the epicenter of the burgeoning film industry, a magnet for hopefuls from across the country. But beneath the glamour of the silent film era was a precarious working-class industry. For every Mary Pickford, there were thousands of people like Marilyn's mother, Gladys Baker, toiling away as film cutters in the studio laboratories, living on the fringes of the fantasy they helped create. This was a world about to be shattered by the Great Depression, an economic cataclysm that deepened the social anxieties of the time. For a child born into this era, especially one born into poverty, with the double stigma of illegitimacy and a family history of mental illness, the world was a profoundly unsafe and judgmental place. Institutions like orphanages and the foster care system were not the benevolent safety nets we imagine today. They were often harsh, underfunded places where a child's emotional needs were an afterthought. Survival was the only goal. It was this environment of instability and moral rigidity that would later give rise to the buttoned-up conformity of the 1950s. It was an era of profound sexual repression, a time when a woman's worth was defined by her role as a wife and mother. Into this world, Marilyn would arrive like a rebellion. But before the rebellion, there was the girl. A girl whose entire life would be a search for the one thing this world never gave her, a safe and loving home. She was born Norma Jeane Mortensen on June 1st, 1926, in the charity ward of Los Angeles County Hospital. Her life began with the two themes that would haunt her forever: abandonment and instability. Her father was an unknown entity, a ghost. The name on her birth certificate, Mortensen, belonged to a man her mother had briefly married and separated from months before Norma Jeane was conceived. The man widely believed to be her biological father was Charles Stanley Gifford, a handsome co-worker at the film lab with whom her mother Gladys had a passionate affair. Gifford, however, refused to acknowledge the child, a rejection that would leave a gaping wound in Norma Jeane's heart for the rest of her life. Her quest for a father figure, for the approval of powerful men, began here. Her mother, Gladys Pearl Baker, was a beautiful, vivacious, but deeply fragile woman. She was herself a product of a traumatic past, and she carried the dark genetic inheritance of mental illness that had plagued her family. Unable to care for a child on her own, she made a decision that was common for single, working mothers of the era. She placed her infant daughter in foster care. For the first 7 years of her life, Norma Jeane lived with a devoutly religious couple, Albert and Ida Bolinder, in the then rural town of Hawthorne. They were strict but stable. It was the closest she would ever come to a conventional childhood. She saw her glamorous mother only on weekends, a fleeting, almost magical visitor who would sweep in and then disappear again. Norma Jeane idolized her, dreaming of the day they would finally have a real home together. That dream briefly came true in 1933. Gladys, having saved enough money, bought a small house and brought her 7-year-old daughter home. For a few precious months, Norma Jeane experienced what it was like to have a mother. But Gladys's mental state was rapidly deteriorating. She became erratic, paranoid, prone to violent outbursts. The dream ended in terror. In early 1934, Gladys suffered a complete psychotic breakdown, screaming that she was dying. She was forcibly removed and committed to the state mental hospital in Norwalk. Norma Jeane would later recall the image of her mother, laughing hysterically as she was dragged away, as one of the most horrifying of her life. She would not see her again for many years. At the age of 9, Norma Jeane became a ward of the state. Her life shattered into a painful kaleidoscope of dislocation. She was sent to the Los Angeles Orphans' Home, a vast, impersonal institution where she felt, in her own words, like nobody's baby. From there, she was shuffled through a series of at least 10 different foster homes. It was a lonely, terrifying existence. She developed a stutter and became a withdrawn, watchful child. It was during this period that she was allegedly sexually abused in one of her foster homes, a trauma that compounded her profound sense of worthlessness and her deep-seated belief that she was somehow bad. She learned a harsh lesson. The world was not safe, and the only person she could rely on was herself. Escape, as it often did for young women of her era, came in the form of an early marriage. In 1942, her latest foster family was moving away. Faced with the terrifying prospect of being sent back to the orphanage, Norma Jeane, just 16 years old, married a 21-year-old neighbor, a handsome factory worker and aspiring police officer named James Jim Dougherty. It was less a romance and more a transaction, a marriage of convenience to secure a roof over her head. For a time, she played the role of a dutiful housewife. But the girl who had spent her life feeling invisible was about to be discovered. Her life changed forever during World War II. While her husband was serving in the Merchant Marine, Norma Jeane, now 18, went to work inspecting parachutes at the Radioplane Munitions Factory. In 1945, a young Army photographer named David Conover arrived at the factory to take pictures of women contributing to the war effort for Yank magazine. As he scanned the assembly line, his lens found Norma Jeane. He was captivated by her natural photogenic quality, the vibrant, almost desperate energy in her smile. He couldn't stop taking pictures of her. Conover's photos were a revelation. He encouraged her to pursue modeling. It was the first time a man, a professional, had told her she was special, that she had something worth looking at. The validation was intoxicating. She signed with the Blue Book Model Agency, one of the top agencies in Los Angeles. She quickly became one of their most successful models, her face gracing the covers of dozens of magazines. Her husband, Jim, returned from the war to find not a quiet housewife, but a budding career woman with ambitions of her own. He gave her an ultimatum, him or the career. She chose the career. They divorced in 1946. It was at the modeling agency that the final, most crucial stage of the transformation began. The agency head, Emmeline Snively, saw her potential, but also her flaws. She convinced Norma Jeane to tame her curly reddish-brown hair. She began the long, arduous process of straightening it and dyeing it various shades of blonde, finally settling on the bombshell platinum that would become her trademark. She learned how to pose, how to smile, how to project an image of confident, carefree sexuality that was the polar opposite of the insecure, frightened girl she was inside. She was consciously, deliberately creating a character who could face the world without fear, a character who was everything Norma Jeane wasn't. In August 1946, her hard work paid off. She was given a screen test at 20th Century Fox. The studio executive Ben Lyne was impressed. He offered her a standard 6-month contract, but he told her the name Norma Jeane had to go. It sounded too plain, too ordinary. Sitting in his office, they came up with a new name, combining the first name of a popular stage actress, Marilyn Miller, with her mother's maiden name, Monroe. In that moment, Norma Jeane Mortensen, the orphan, the foster child, the lonely girl who nobody wanted, officially ceased to exist. In her place stood a new creation, a shimmering blonde promise of glamour and desire. In her place stood Marilyn Monroe. She had a new name, a new face, and a new chance at life. But she was carrying the ghosts of her past with her into a world that would worship her image but would have no time for the real, wounded person behind it. With a new name and a 6-month contract at 20th Century Fox, the girl formerly known as Norma Jeane had seemingly won the lottery. But an entry ticket to the Dream Factory was not a guarantee of success. It was merely the beginning of a brutal fight for survival. She had created Marilyn Monroe as her shield, but she was still carrying the ghosts of Norma Jeane into a world that would worship her image, but have no time for the real wounded person behind it. Her first few years were a frustrating lesson in anonymity. The studio saw her not as a unique talent, but as one of 100 other pretty blondes on the lot. She was put through the standard starlet factory, acting classes, singing lessons, dance training, and endless publicity photo shoots designed to sell an image. Her roles were minuscule, often uncredited. She was the girl on the phone, the waitress in the background, a decorative piece of set dressing. In 1947, after a year of going nowhere, Fox declined to renew her contract. The rejection was a terrifying blow, a confirmation of her deepest fears of being unwanted. For a brief, desperate period, she was adrift, but her ambition, forged in the fires of her childhood, was relentless. She soon signed another short-lived contract with the smaller, less prestigious Columbia Pictures. It was here that she was given her first significant role in the B-movie musical, Ladies of the Chorus. And it was here that she met her first mentor and vocal coach, Fred Karger, with whom she had a brief, painful love affair. He saw her potential but ultimately dismissed her as not being wife material, a rejection that deeply wounded her. Once again, Columbia Pictures dropped her, and by 1949, she was back where she started, unemployed and all but forgotten. The year 1949 was one of the lowest points in her life. She was broke, struggling to find work, and terrified of being dragged back into the oblivion she had fought so hard to escape. It was during this period of intense desperation that she made a decision that would both save her and haunt her for the rest of her career. For a one-time fee of $50, enough to make a payment on her car and keep from being evicted, she agreed to pose for a series of nude photographs for a local photographer. It was an act of pure survival, a choice made by the desperate Norma Jeane, not the glamorous Marilyn. In the photos, she looks vulnerable, almost innocent, a world away from the confident bombshell she would become. She believed the photos would never surface. It was a secret she hoped to bury. But in Hollywood, secrets have a way of coming back. Her professional salvation came in the form of one of Hollywood's most powerful agents, Johnny Hyde. Hyde was a legendary figure, a vice president at the William Morris Agency, but he was also a man in his 50s, short in stature and in failing health. He met Marilyn at a party and was instantly captivated, not just by her beauty, but by her vulnerability and her raw, untamed ambition. He became obsessed, leaving his wife and dedicating the last years of his life to a single, all-consuming goal: making Marilyn Monroe a star. Hyde was another in a long line of controlling older men in Marilyn's life, but his belief in her was absolute. He used his immense influence to get her auditions, coached her, and even paid for minor plastic surgery on her chin and nose to refine her look. He was in love with her and desperately wanted to marry her, but she refused, fond of him but unable to return his romantic feelings. It was Hyde who stormed the offices of 20th Century Fox and fought for her, securing her two small but crucial roles in 1950 that would change her trajectory forever. The first was in John Huston's gritty crime drama, The Asphalt Jungle. As the naive, sultry mistress of a crooked lawyer, she was on screen for less than 5 minutes, but her performance was electric. She radiated a kind of tragic, misplaced innocence that was impossible to ignore. The second role was in the Hollywood masterpiece, All About Eve. She played Miss Caswell, an aspiring actress described as a graduate of the Copacabana School of Dramatic Arts. It was a witty, self-aware performance, a perfect miniature of the very dumb blonde stereotype she was simultaneously embodying and trying to transcend. The roles were small, but the impact was enormous. Critics and audiences were captivated. Johnny Hyde used this momentum to force 20th Century Fox to give her what he had been fighting for all along, a 7-year contract. In late 1950, just days after securing her future, Johnny Hyde collapsed and died of a heart attack. Marilyn was devastated, overwhelmed with a mixture of grief and guilt. Her greatest champion was gone, but he had given her the one thing she needed most: a real chance. Armed with her new contract, Marilyn began a steady climb. But it was 1953 that would become her year of detonation, the year she transformed from a promising starlet into a global phenomenon with a trio of films that would forever define her image. The first was the Technicolor noir, Niagara. For the first time, she was given top billing, playing a seductive, adulterous wife who plots to murder her husband. The studio's marketing was entirely focused on her body, with posters famously proclaiming her a raging torrent of emotion that even nature can't control. The film featured a now legendary shot of Marilyn, seen from behind, walking away from the camera for a full 116 feet of film. It was dubbed the longest walk in cinema history, and it cemented her status as a potent, almost dangerous sexual force. The second film, and perhaps her most famous, was Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. As the diamond-obsessed showgirl, Lorelei Lee, Marilyn perfected the dumb blonde persona. She was hilarious, charming, and utterly captivating. Her performance of Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend in a shocking pink satin gown is one of the most iconic musical numbers ever filmed, imitated by everyone from Madonna to pop stars of the 21st century. Off-screen, she was anything but dumb. She was a shrewd and dedicated professional who understood every angle of the camera and every nuance of her character. Her co-star, the sharp-witted Jane Russell, was astonished by her intelligence and dismissed the dumb blonde label as a complete fiction. The third film of her trifecta was How to Marry a Millionaire, which teamed her with Hollywood's reigning glamour queen, Betty Grable, and the sophisticated Lauren Bacall. Marilyn, playing the hilariously nearsighted Pola, more than held her own, stealing scenes with her brilliant comedic timing. By the end of 1953, there was no question. Marilyn Monroe was the biggest movie star in the world. It was during this meteoric rise that the secret she had tried to bury came back to haunt her. The nude calendar photo she had posed for in 1949 resurfaced. A rival studio, hoping to create a scandal that would derail her career, leaked the story to the press. For a moment, it seemed her career was over. The moralistic studio heads at Fox wanted her to deny it. But Marilyn, in a move of astonishingly savvy public relations, decided to tell the truth. She gave an interview, frankly admitting that she had posed for the pictures because she was broke and hungry. "Why the big fuss?" she asked. "I hadn't done anything wrong." The public, instead of being scandalized, fell in love with her honesty and her underdog story. The scandal, which was meant to destroy her, only made her more famous, more human, and more beloved. In just a few short years, the lonely girl named Norma Jeane had successfully transformed herself into Marilyn Monroe, the world's ultimate love goddess. She had achieved a level of fame and adoration that was almost unimaginable. The persona she had so carefully constructed, a potent mixture of breathtaking sexuality and wide-eyed childlike innocence, had conquered the world. But the persona was now becoming a golden cage. The world was in love with the giggling, helpless bombshell she played on screen. But the intelligent, ambitious, and still wounded woman behind the image was beginning to suffocate inside it, desperate to prove she was more than just a body, more than just a joke. The battle for her own soul was about to begin. By 1954, the world belonged to Marilyn Monroe. She was no longer a struggling starlet, but a global phenomenon, the undisputed queen of the Hollywood box office. The dumb blonde persona she had perfected had become a golden cage, making her a fortune for the studio but suffocating the intelligent, ambitious artist within. Having conquered the world with an image she was beginning to despise, her next chapter would become a two-front war, a public battle against the studio for artistic respect, and a private, turbulent quest for love and stability in the arms of an American hero, Joe DiMaggio, a man who loved Norma Jeane but hated Marilyn. By 1954, Marilyn Monroe was no longer just a movie star. She was a force of nature, the living embodiment of the Hollywood dream. But the dream was beginning to feel like a cage. The dumb blonde persona she had perfected was a commercial goldmine for 20th Century Fox. But for the intelligent, ambitious woman behind the image, it was a straitjacket. She was the most famous woman in the world, and she was suffocating. Her next chapter would be defined by a desperate two-front war, a public battle for artistic respect, and a private, even more turbulent battle for love. Her search for a protector, for a father figure who could shield her from the world that was consuming her, led her to an American icon. Joe DiMaggio was everything Marilyn was not. Joltin' Joe, the Yankee Clipper, was a national hero, a man defined by his quiet dignity, his grace under pressure, and his fierce desire for privacy. She was the explosive, vulnerable sex symbol whose life was lived in the headlines. Their romance was a collision of American mythologies. He was captivated by the fragile, sweet Norma Jeane he saw in private. She was in awe of his strength and integrity, seeing in him the strong, silent protector she had craved her entire life. Their wedding on January 14th, 1954, at San Francisco City Hall was a global media event. The crowds were so immense they nearly crushed the couple. It was the union of America's sweethearts, a fairy tale that seemed too good to be true. And it was. The marriage was a catastrophe from the start. DiMaggio, a traditionalist, had a very specific vision of marriage. He wanted a wife who would stay home, cook his meals, and leave the spotlight behind. He had married Marilyn Monroe, but he wanted to possess Norma Jeane. He hated her career. He hated her sexy clothes. He hated the way other men looked at her. His love was suffocating, conditional on her surrendering the very identity that had made her a star. His infamous jealousy manifested in long, brooding silences, and, according to many of her closest friends, explosive, violent rages. The final spectacular implosion of their marriage occurred on a warm September night in New York City. Marilyn was filming what would become the most iconic scene of her career for the movie The 7-Year Itch. The scene was shot on Lexington Avenue, with her character standing over a subway grate, her white dress billowing up around her as a train passes underneath. Director Billy Wilder, a master of publicity, had invited the press. Thousands of onlookers and photographers gathered, creating a circus-like atmosphere. For hours, take after take, Marilyn performed, laughing as her dress flew up, a vision of carefree, innocent sexuality. Watching from the shadows, his face a mask of thunderous rage, was Joe DiMaggio. He saw the scene not as a piece of cinematic art, but as a vulgar exhibition. Back at their hotel, he allegedly exploded. Friends who were there that night reported hearing sounds of a violent struggle. The next morning, Marilyn appeared on set, covered in bruises that had to be concealed with makeup. That night was the breaking point. Just 9 months after their fairy tale wedding, a tearful, visibly bruised Marilyn Monroe stood before a wall of cameras and announced their divorce, citing mental cruelty. The American dream was over. But in a poignant, heartbreaking epilogue to their story, DiMaggio never stopped loving her. He would re-enter her life in its final, desperate year, and after her death it was he who would claim her body, arrange her funeral, and for 20 years have roses delivered to her grave 3 times a week. The end of her marriage to DiMaggio coincided with the boldest professional move of her life. Fed up with being underpaid and typecast in frivolous comedies by Fox, Marilyn did the unthinkable. In late 1954, she used a clause in her contract, fled Hollywood, and moved to New York City. She was officially on strike against her own studio. It was a revolutionary act of defiance. No female star of her magnitude had ever dared to challenge the all-powerful studio system so directly. The press mocked her, and the studio head, Darryl F. Zanuck, was apoplectic, vowing to ruin her. But Marilyn was determined to reinvent herself. She wanted to be seen not as a bombshell, but as an artist. She immersed herself in the intellectual and theatrical world of New York, and she took the terrifying step of enrolling in the most prestigious and intimidating acting school in America, the Actors Studio. It was run by the legendary Lee Strasberg, the high priest of method acting. Her classmates were a who's who of the next generation of great actors, including Marlon Brando, Paul Newman, and Geraldine Page. To man, priest of method acting. Her classmates were a who's who of the next generation of great actors, including Marlon Brando, Paul Newman, and Geraldine Page. To many of them, the arrival of the world's biggest movie star was a joke. They saw her as a vapid glamour queen, out of her depth. Marilyn was petrified. She would sit at the back of the class, trembling, too intimidated to perform. But Strasberg saw something else. Beneath the anxiety and the breathy voice, he saw a raw, incandescent talent, an instrument of immense emotional depth and vulnerability. "I've worked with hundreds and hundreds of actors and actresses," he would later say, "and there are only two that stand out way above the rest. Number one is Marlon Brando, and the second is Marilyn Monroe." His validation became one of the most important touchstones of her life. While studying, she also made a brilliant business move. With her friend, the photographer Milton Green, she formed her own independent company, Marilyn Monroe Productions. Her goal was to develop her own projects and have creative control. It was a declaration of war against the studio. For over a year, a legal and public relations battle raged. But in the end, Marilyn won. Fox, realizing they could not afford to lose their biggest star, capitulated. They offered her a new groundbreaking contract that gave her a massive salary, full script approval, and the right to work with outside directors. She had taken on the system and emerged victorious. It was during this period of artistic rebirth in New York that she reconnected with a man who represented everything she aspired to be, Arthur Miller. Miller was America's preeminent playwright, the intellectual conscience of a generation, author of masterpieces like Death of a Salesman and The Crucible. They had met briefly years before in Hollywood, but now their relationship deepened into a profound intellectual and emotional love affair. Their marriage in June 1956 was even more shocking to the world than her union with DiMaggio. The press condescendingly dubbed them the egghead and the hourglass. But for Marilyn, it was the ultimate validation. Miller saw the intelligent, poetic, and deeply wounded Norma Jeane behind the Marilyn mask. He read her journals, respected her mind, and encouraged her artistic ambitions. In him, she believed she had finally found the intellectual father figure, the protector, and the soulmate she had been searching for her entire life. Their partnership was immediately tested. Just as they were married, Miller was called to testify before the notoriously anti-communist House Un-American Activities Committee. He was cited for contempt of Congress for refusing to name names of alleged communist sympathizers. At the height of the Cold War witch hunts, associating with someone under such scrutiny was career suicide. The studio begged Marilyn to distance herself from him. Instead, she stood by him defiantly, publicly. It was an act of incredible courage and loyalty that risked everything she had just fought for. But the dream marriage began to crumble under the weight of impossible pressures. The quiet, intellectual life Miller cherished was constantly invaded by the chaos of Marilyn's fame, and their shared, desperate desire for a family was met with devastating heartbreak. In 1957, Marilyn suffered an ectopic pregnancy, followed by 2 separate miscarriages, one of which occurred after a difficult and chaotic shoot in England for the film The Prince and the Showgirl. Her lifelong dream of becoming a mother was shattered. The grief, combined with her deep-seated insecurities, sent her into a spiral of depression. Her insomnia became chronic and unbearable. Her dependency on prescription drugs, which had begun years earlier, now became a central, terrifying feature of her life. A coterie of competing doctors kept her supplied with a dangerous cocktail of barbiturates, like Nembutal and Seconal to put her to sleep, and amphetamines like Dexedrine to wake her up and get her to the set. She was becoming trapped in a vicious, state-sanctioned cycle of addiction, her mood swinging wildly, her sense of reality beginning to fray. She had won her freedom from the studio, but she was becoming a prisoner of her own mind and of the little bottles on her nightstand. She had fought for and won the life she had always wanted. She was a respected artist, a powerful producer, and the wife of a great intellectual. But the ghosts of Norma Jeane were proving to be relentless. The foundation of her new life, built on so much hope, was beginning to crack under the weight of her past trauma and her present pain. She was about to deliver some of the greatest performances of her career, but they would be a prelude to her final tragic descent. Having won her war with the studio and married the great intellectual Arthur Miller, Marilyn Monroe had, on the surface, achieved everything she ever wanted. She was a respected artist, a powerful producer, and the wife of a man who cherished her mind. But this hard-won victory was built on fragile ground. The private grief of her miscarriages and her deepening dependency on a cocktail of prescription drugs began to erode the foundations of her new life. She was about to enter the final, most turbulent phase of her career, where her on-screen brilliance would be a mirror to her off-screen disintegration, and her desperate search for a protector would lead her into the dangerous orbit of the most powerful family in America. By 1958, Marilyn Monroe had seemingly achieved the impossible. She had won her war with the studio, earned the respect of the New York theatrical elite, and found a partner in the great American playwright, Arthur Miller. She was a respected artist, a powerful producer, and the wife of an intellectual giant. But the ghosts of Norma Jeane, the traumas of her past, were not so easily vanquished. The foundation of her new life, built on so much hope, was beginning to crack under the weight of her grief and her growing dependency on the prescription drugs that promised her sleep, confidence, and escape. She was about to deliver the most brilliant comedic performance of her career, but it would be a masterpiece created in the middle of a nervous breakdown. That film was 1959's Some Like It Hot. Directed by the legendary Billy Wilder, it is now considered one of the greatest film comedies of all time. As Sugar Cane, the sweet, boozy, and heartbreakingly vulnerable ukulele player, Marilyn was luminous, a perfect blend of innocent sexuality and flawless comedic timing. She was never funnier, never more lovable. But behind the scenes, the production was a now legendary nightmare, a window into her disintegrating mental state. Her chronic lateness became a crisis, with the cast and crew often waiting for hours for her to emerge from her trailer. Her inability to remember even the simplest lines became a source of extreme tension. For a single line, "Where's that bourbon?" she reportedly required over 40 takes. Her co-star Tony Curtis was openly hostile, later infamously remarking that kissing her was like kissing Hitler. Only the gentle and patient Jack Lemmon seemed to have any sympathy for her profound and visible struggle. She was accompanied everywhere by her acting coach, Paula Strasberg, who would whisper encouragement to her before each take, much to the fury of director Billy Wilder. The arrangement, Wilder later said, was like talking to a patient in a mental hospital through her nurse. What almost no one on set knew was that during the chaotic shoot, Marilyn was pregnant, and shortly after filming wrapped, she suffered yet another devastating miscarriage. The triumph of the film was, for her, inextricably linked with profound personal loss. Her final completed film, 1961's The Misfits, was less a movie and more a public autopsy of her life and her dying marriage. The screenplay was written for her by Arthur Miller, intended as a love letter, a dramatic vehicle to finally prove her greatness as a serious actress. But it was a love letter written from a place of deep frustration and sorrow. The character of Rosalind Tabor was, in essence, Marilyn herself, a beautiful, deeply empathetic, but lost and directionless woman, used and misunderstood by the damaged men around her. The script was so painfully close to home that she felt Miller had written a part for a whore, a sad, pathetic whore. The production was a descent into hell. Filmed in the brutal 100-degree heat of the Nevada desert, the set became a nexus of Hollywood tragedy. Her co-star, the legendary Clark Gable, the idol of her childhood, was in failing health. He would suffer a fatal heart attack just days after filming ended. Her other co-star, Montgomery Clift, was a fellow tortured soul, his own life being destroyed by alcohol and prescription drugs. And at the center of it all was the complete disintegration of her marriage to Miller. They were living in separate quarters, barely speaking. Her drug use spiraled completely out of control. Her lateness became so extreme that the production was forced to shut down for 2 weeks while she was hospitalized for a complete nervous exhaustion, a euphemism for detoxification. The pain we see on screen in The Misfits is not acting. It is the raw, unvarnished anguish of Norma Jeane. By the time the film was released, her divorce from Arthur Miller had been finalized. Now divorced for a third time and approaching her mid-30s, Marilyn felt more isolated and vulnerable than ever. It was during this period, from 1961 to 1962, that her life became dangerously entangled with the most powerful family in America, the Kennedys. Her affair with President John F. Kennedy, which had likely been sporadic for years, reportedly intensified. According to numerous well-sourced biographies, she would be secretly flown to see him, a clandestine relationship managed by his brother-in-law, the actor Peter Lawford. But it was her subsequent relationship with the president's younger brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, that allegedly became more serious and emotionally intense. For Marilyn, who had spent her life searching for a powerful protector, the charismatic and brilliant RFK was the ultimate father figure. But for the Kennedys, a serious, emotionally needy relationship with the world's most famous and increasingly unstable movie star was a political time bomb. It was during this time that Marilyn, according to friends, began to feel she was more than just a secret lover. She felt she was part of the inner circle of power. She allegedly kept a small red diary in which she documented the intimate and often sensitive political secrets she overheard from the brothers, discussions about Cuba, the mob, and other matters of state. Whether this diary truly existed or not, Marilyn believed she held dangerous secrets, and she began to feel used, passed from one brother to the other, and she started making desperate late-night phone calls to the White House and the Department of Justice. Her entanglement reached its spectacular and infamous climax on May 19, 1962. Disobeying orders from 20th Century Fox, where she was filming a new movie, she flew to New York to appear at President Kennedy's 45th birthday gala at Madison Square Garden. What followed is one of the most legendary moments in 20th century pop culture. The performance was a sensation, a moment of pure, electrifying seduction. But it was also a shocking and reckless public display of her intimacy with the president. In that moment, the secret affair was no longer a secret. The Kennedy camp was reportedly horrified. The performance, intended as a loving tribute, was seen as a major liability. In the weeks that followed, the Kennedy brothers began to abruptly and coldly distance themselves from her. Her phone calls were no longer returned. She was being cut off. The rejection sent her into a tailspin. Just a few weeks later, she was unceremoniously fired by 20th Century Fox. From her film, Something's Got to Give, for her chronic lateness and absences. She was now professionally humiliated, politically abandoned, and more emotionally isolated than ever. Her final weeks were a blur of paranoia and desperation. Friends reported that she believed her house was bugged, that she was being watched. Her reliance on her psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, who was now administering her medications directly, became all-encompassing. The stage was set for the final tragedy. She was a woman in possession of dangerous secrets. She was entangled with the most powerful men in the world, who now saw her as a threat. She was professionally disgraced, and she was in the care of doctors who were supplying her with a lethal arsenal of prescription drugs. As the sun set over Los Angeles on Saturday, August 4th, 1962, the final tragic scene of Marilyn Monroe's life was about to begin. The performance at Madison Square Garden was Marilyn's last great moment in the spotlight. In the weeks that followed, the forces that had been circling her for years finally closed in. Abandoned by the Kennedys, fired by her studio, and increasingly lost in a fog of paranoia and prescription drugs, she was more isolated than ever before. The stage was set for the final tragic scene. The events of the night of August 4th, 1962, would become a maze of conflicting testimonies, missing evidence, and a timeline that defied logic, transforming her death from a personal tragedy into an enduring and explosive historical mystery. The final day of Marilyn Monroe's life was a study in contradictions. She had been rehired by 20th Century Fox, a professional victory. She had made plans with friends for the following day, but those who spoke to her, like her ex-stepson, Joe DiMaggio Jr., described her as sounding distant, sedated. She was a woman on the edge, caught between a glimmer of hope for the future and the crushing weight of her present isolation. As night fell on Los Angeles, the final tragic scene of her life was about to begin, a scene so shrouded in mystery and conflicting accounts that it continues to be debated to this day. The official story, patched together from the initial police reports, is simple. Marilyn spent the evening at home making phone calls. Her psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, had visited her earlier in the day. Her housekeeper, Eunice Murray, was staying overnight. At some point in the night, Marilyn took a massive overdose of Nembutal capsules and died in her sleep. Murray, seeing a light under her locked bedroom door around 3 a.m., felt something was wrong. She called Dr. Greenson, who rushed over, broke the window to get into the room, and found Marilyn dead. After consulting with lawyers, the police were finally called at 4:25 a.m. But that official timeline is a fiction, a narrative that collapsed under the weight of its own inconsistencies almost immediately. The truth of that night is far darker and more complex. The controversy begins with the players who were not in the official report. According to the most credible investigative accounts, meticulously detailed by journalist Anthony Summers, both Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy and his brother-in-law, the actor Peter Lawford, were in Los Angeles that day. Lawford would later confess to friends that a frantic Marilyn had been calling him, desperate to speak to RFK, who was avoiding her. The most explosive version of events suggests that RFK, her story is a stark warning about the destructive nature of fame, the brutal objectification of women, and the devastating consequences of untreated mental illness and prescription drug abuse. She was a victim of a sexist industry that celebrated her body but dismissed her mind, and a medical establishment that medicated her pain instead of healing it. In recent years, however, there has been a significant reevaluation of her legacy. Feminist critics and biographers now highlight her intelligence, her business acumen, and her courage. They see her not as a passive victim, but as a savvy and talented artist who bravely fought for control in a patriarchal system and, for a time, won. She was not a dumb blonde. She was playing one, a subversive act of commentary on the very image she was trapped within. Marilyn Monroe was a paradox. She was the world's most desired woman, yet she died profoundly alone. She was the embodiment of joy and pleasure on screen. Yet her private life was a landscape of pain and sorrow. The world fell in love with a brilliant, shimmering illusion named Marilyn, but in doing so, it overlooked and ultimately failed the fragile, searching woman named Norma Jeane. Whether she was a victim of a political conspiracy, a negligent medical system, or her own inner demons, the conclusion remains the same. Her death was not the beginning of her tragedy, but its inevitable end. Her story is a heartbreaking reminder that the images we worship are often just that, images masking a complex and often suffering human being beneath. Her lifelong search was not for fame or fortune, but for a sense of safety, stability, and unconditional love that she was denied from her very first breath. Hollywood gave her a pedestal, but it could not give her a home. It made her a goddess, but it could not make her feel worthy of love. The dream it built for her was magnificent, but in the end, it was a dream from which she could never wake up.